When German soldiers fell into American hands during the Second World War, their minds were filled with terror born from years of systematic propaganda. The Wehrmacht had drilled into them a vision of Americans as ruthless criminals, descendants of Chicago gangsters who would show zero compassion to any German unfortunate enough to become their prisoner. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years constructing an image of the United States as a degenerate nation, a chaotic mixture of jazz-obsessed degenerates and violent mobsters who would certainly torture and execute any German soldier they captured. As trains carrying thousands upon thousands of captured Germans rolled westward from eastern seaboard ports, heading deep into America's interior toward detention facilities spread across states they had only heard about in geography lessons, most of these men were convinced they were traveling toward their execution. They sat in those railway cars, watching unfamiliar American landscapes pass by their windows, certain that each mile brought them closer to death. The propaganda had been so thorough, so relentless, that even as they observed the peaceful farmland and small towns of America, they could not shake the conviction that they were doomed. The transformation began the instant they stepped off those transport vehicles at camps scattered throughout Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and other states across the American heartland. What greeted them bore no resemblance whatsoever to the torture chambers and execution grounds they had been led to expect. American military police, rather than forming firing squads, processed them with the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized American military operations. Everything was documented, everything was systematic, everything was orderly in a way that seemed almost absurdly mundane given the circumstances. Clerks sat at typewriters, recording each prisoner's name with careful precision. Photographers set up proper lighting equipment to take identification photographs, treating the task with professional seriousness. Medical personnel conducted examinations that were genuinely medical in nature, documenting injuries and ailments not for the purpose of exploitation but for actual treatment. Each prisoner received an identification number, was given written receipts for any personal items that were confiscated, and was then directed toward the compounds themselves. These compounds, visible through the gates, looked nothing like the death camps the prisoners had imagined during their journey. The physical infrastructure of these American prisoner-of-war camps contradicted everything the captured Germans thought they knew about their fate. Behind perimeter fences topped with barbed wire stood orderly rows of wooden barracks that had been constructed according to United States military building standards. These were not crude shelters or warehouse-style buildings meant to pack humans together like livestock. Each barrack featured windows that could actually be opened to allow fresh air circulation, doors equipped with locks that could be secured from the interior, and electric lighting systems that functioned reliably. The buildings were subdivided into smaller rooms designed for manageable groups rather than vast open spaces crammed with bodies. Between the buildings ran concrete pathways that kept foot traffic out of the mud. Drainage systems had been engineered to prevent the flooding that turned military camps into swamps during rainstorms. Different areas of the compound had been designated for specific purposes, creating an organizational logic to the space. Men who had spent months sleeping in muddy foxholes or improvised shelters found themselves being assigned to actual beds. Not bare wooden platforms or piles of straw, but genuine beds with mattresses and blankets. The shock of this discovery was profound and immediate. The food situation proved even more disorienting than the physical accommodations. Within mere hours of their arrival at these camps, the prisoners received hot meals that contained more nutritional value and variety than German forces had been receiving for many months, perhaps even years. There was recognizable meat rather than mysterious processed protein. Fresh vegetables that had color and texture rather than being wilted or preserved beyond recognition. White bread made from actual wheat flour instead of the grey, sawdust-extended substance that had become standard in Germany. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute made from roasted grains and roots. Many prisoners initially refused to eat, genuinely believing the food must be poisoned. This was the logical conclusion given what they had been told about American intentions. But hunger is a powerful force, and eventually suspicion gave way to desperate need. When they ate and did not die, when they finished meals and felt genuinely satisfied rather than still hungry, the psychological impact was tremendous. Even more shocking was learning that the Americans were feeding them the exact same rations that American troops received. They were not being given inferior scraps or mouldy leftovers. The same food that sustained American soldiers was being provided to enemy prisoners. The medical treatment available in these camps stunned men who had watched their comrades die from wounds that should have been survivable with proper care. American medical officers conducted thorough examinations of every single prisoner, methodically documenting everything from dental cavities to chronic diseases that had gone untreated during years of warfare. Antibiotics, which had achieved almost mythical status in the German military due to their scarcity, were administered routinely and without hesitation. Surgical procedures were performed using actual anesthesia rather than having men bite down on leather straps. Men who had been hiding infected wounds for weeks or months, terrified to report them because treatment resources were non-existent, found themselves in hospital wards where American nurses changed their bandages daily with fresh, clean materials. The composition of prisoners within each camp had been carefully planned by American authorities who understood group dynamics. Officers were separated from enlisted personnel, though they did not receive significantly superior treatment. Sailors from the Kriegsmarine found themselves mixed with Luftwaffe pilots and Wehrmacht infantry soldiers. Ages ranged from teenagers who had been hastily conscripted in the final desperate months of the war to career soldiers who had served for decades. This deliberate mixing served a strategic purpose beyond simple administrative convenience. It prevented the reformation of cohesive military units that might organize resistance or attempt escapes. It broke down the strict hierarchies that had defined German military life. Within just a few days, a daily routine established itself throughout these camps, a routine so regular and predictable that it contrasted starkly with the chaos that had characterized the Wehrmacht's collapse in the war's final stages. Wake-up occurred at 6 in the morning. Organized washing periods followed, with running water and actual soap available. Breakfast was served at 7. Work details were organized for prisoners who volunteered, with payment provided in camp currency that could be spent in canteens. Lunch came at noon, dinner at 1700 hours, lights out at 2000 hours. The mechanical precision of this schedule, maintained day after day without variation, stood in sharp contrast to the disintegrating discipline they had experienced as Germany's military crumbled. The hygiene requirements imposed by American camp authorities represented the first major cultural shock these prisoners experienced beyond the basic surprise of not being executed. Every single prisoner was required to shower at minimum twice per week. Hair had to be kept short and neat. Regular shaving with provided safety razors was mandatory. Fingernails had to be trimmed and kept clean. Teeth had to be brushed using supplied tooth powder. For men who had gone months or even years without proper bathing facilities, who had become so accustomed to lice infestations that they barely noticed the constant itching anymore, these requirements seemed to belong to a peacetime civilization that they thought had ceased to exist. The establishment of actual barbershops within weeks of a camp's opening seemed like an impossible luxury, something so beyond the realm of necessity that its existence defied comprehension. Buildings were designated specifically for this purpose and equipped with genuine barber chairs, large mirrors, electric hair clippers, professional scissors, combs, brushes, and all the various implements associated with civilized grooming. The sight of these facilities, operated with the same attention to professionalism one would find in any small-town American barbershop on Main Street, created a cognitive dissonance that prisoners struggled to process. They were captives, defeated enemies, yet they were being offered barbershop services as if they were paying customers. The barbers themselves were frequently German prisoners who had worked in the trade before the war. A man who had operated a barbershop in Munich or Hamburg found himself once again wielding professional scissors and clippers, though now under armed guard in a prison camp thousands of miles from home in Texas or Oklahoma. These prisoner barbers received payment in camp scrip for their services. They were given slightly improved living quarters as an acknowledgement of their skilled labor. Different barbers developed reputations based on their skill and style, and some became more sought after than others. The normal marketplace dynamics of customer preference emerged even within the confines of barbed wire fencing. Sitting in an actual barber chair while another human being carefully trimmed your hair with proper tools represented a transformative experience for men who had been reduced to pure survival mode for so long. The mirrors positioned around these barbershops confronted prisoners with their own reflections, many seeing themselves properly for the first time in months or years. Some men wept when they saw what they had become, mourning the youth that had been stolen by years of warfare. Others discovered with surprise that beneath the accumulated dirt and the weight of defeat, they still resembled the people they had been before the war consumed their lives. These barbershops operated on strict schedules that were publicly posted and rigorously maintained. Appointments were logged in record books. Waiting lists were maintained and updated. Services were distributed with surprising equality that ignored former military rank. A man who had been a colonel in the Wehrmacht might find himself waiting in line behind a private, with American guards displaying complete indifference to these previous distinctions. This democratization of service happened without fanfare or comment. It was simply the way Americans organized things, treating men as individuals rather than as representatives of a military hierarchy. Haircutting styles were regulated to ensure military short standards, but individual preferences were permitted within those parameters. A prisoner could request his hair slightly longer on top or trimmed closer on the sides. The ability to make even such small choices exercised mental capacities that military service and captivity had caused to atrophy. In an environment where virtually every aspect of existence was controlled by others, making a personal decision about hair length represented a tiny act of individual will, a small assertion of selfhood. Beyond their primary grooming function, these barbershops served important social purposes that American authorities may or may not have fully anticipated. While waiting for their appointments, prisoners exchanged information about how the war was progressing, shared news from different compounds within the camp, and discussed rumors about when they might be sent home. The barber chairs themselves became confessionals of a sort, places where men spoke more freely than they did in the barracks where walls had ears. Normal barbershop conversation about sports and weather took on layered meaning when conducted between former enemies on enemy soil, with both barber and customer trying to make sense of their surreal circumstances. The electric hair clippers fascinated prisoners in ways that went beyond their immediate function. These camps had reliable electricity for powering barber tools, while cities across Germany were going dark due to destroyed infrastructure and fuel shortages. The steady, predictable hum of electric clippers operating day after day became associated in prisoners' minds with American material abundance, a constant audible reminder of the industrial capacity that had ultimately defeated Germany. Every haircut became a small demonstration of the resource gap between the two nations. Shaving equipment presented another layer of unexpected dignity restored to men who had been dehumanized by years of brutal warfare. Prisoners were issued safety razors along with regularly replaced blades. Shaving cream was provided, rather than requiring men to use just water or soap. Mirrors were available in the washing facilities so men could see what they were doing rather than shaving blind. The simple act of shaving transformed from an impossible luxury into a regular ritual that separated civilized routine from the barbarism of the battlefield. The establishment of comprehensive tailoring services seemed impossibly generous to men whose uniforms had literally rotted on their bodies during the war's final campaigns. American quartermasters had calculated that maintaining prisoner clothing through repair was more economical than constantly providing replacements, and they recognized that prisoners who possessed tailoring skills could provide valuable labor. Buildings were equipped with industrial sewing machines, large cutting tables, organizational storage for thread and buttons, needles of various sizes, and fabric that exceeded in quality anything available in Germany during the final years of war. These tailoring workshops were organized with characteristic American industrial efficiency. Sewing machines were arranged in neat rows with proper task lighting positioned above each station. Thread was stored in organized cabinets with different colors clearly labeled. Patterns were posted on walls for easy reference. Damaged clothing was collected according to published schedules, sorted by type and severity of damage, and distributed to workers whose skills matched the required repairs. The entire operation functioned like a small factory. Prisoner tailors were selected based purely on their skill level rather than their former military rank. A master tailor from Hamburg, who had operated his own shop before conscription, might find himself supervising a workshop where former Wehrmacht officers worked under his technical direction. This pragmatic American approach to labor allocation created new social dynamics within the camps, environments where demonstrated competence mattered more than previous status or the insignia that had once adorned their uniforms. The first priority for these tailoring operations was repairing the uniforms prisoners had been wearing when captured. Garments that consisted more of holes than intact fabric were methodically assessed and mended. Watching rags transform into wearable clothing provided tangible proof that the Americans genuinely intended to maintain their prisoners properly rather than allowing them to deteriorate. Each repaired uniform represented a small restoration of human dignity. Once the backlog of repairs had been managed, production of new clothing items began. Work uniforms suitable for labor details were cut and sewn. Shirts, underwear, and even pajamas were manufactured from fabric that seemed impossibly abundant to men from a nation that had been rationing textiles for years. Patterns were adjusted to accommodate different body types, acknowledging individual physical differences in ways that military uniformity typically ignored or suppressed. The workshops produced more than just personal clothing. Blankets were manufactured for colder months. Sheets were sewn for the beds. Towels were produced for the washing facilities. Curtains were made for barracks windows, allowing prisoners to control light and privacy to some degree. Each of these items accumulated gradually, transforming the compounds from austere imprisonment facilities into environments that felt more like extremely basic housing. Winter clothing production became absolutely critical as seasons changed and temperatures dropped. Germans who had arrived during summer months wearing lightweight uniforms suddenly needed warm garments to survive northern winters in places like Wisconsin or Michigan. The systematic preparation for these seasonal changes demonstrated long-term planning by American authorities, planning that clearly indicated prisoners would neither be executed nor quickly released. They were being maintained for an indefinite duration. Laundry services emerged as perhaps the single most impressively systematic aspect of camp maintenance operations. Industrial-scale washing machines, powered by seemingly unlimited electricity and supplied with hot water from massive boilers, operated on fixed schedules, processing thousands of individual garments every single week. For men who had worn the same filthy uniform for months without being able to properly clean it, the sight of these machines seemed to belong to a fantasy world of American abundance that bore no relation to the resource-constrained reality they had known in Germany. The laundry facilities occupied dedicated buildings with concrete floors specifically engineered for proper drainage and ventilation systems designed to manage the tremendous amounts of steam generated by industrial washing operations. Rows of washing machines, each unit larger than anything most Germans had ever seen in civilian life, operated with mechanical precision. The industrial scale of these operations demonstrated American logistical capabilities that absolutely dwarfed anything Germany had achieved even at the height of its power. Prisoners who were assigned to work in the laundry facilities learned to operate these machines according to strict operational protocols. Clothing had to be sorted by type and color. Water temperatures were specified precisely for different fabric types. Detergent was measured accurately rather than guessed. Washing times were standardized and enforced. The scientific approach to what might seem like a mundane task reflected a characteristically American faith in systematic methods and procedural standardization. Each individual prisoner's clothing was marked with their unique identification number, ensuring that items were returned to the correct owner after washing. This individual tracking system seemed impossibly complex to men who had become accustomed to the communal anonymity of military life. Yet the system successfully processed hundreds of individual bundles every single week with remarkable accuracy. Lost items were rare. Soap powder was dispensed in quantities that seemed almost criminally wasteful to men from a nation where soap had been strictly rationed for years. Fresh boxes of detergent were opened each shift. White powder was scooped generously into the washing machines without the careful measuring that scarcity had made habitual. The sharp, clean smell of industrial detergent gradually replaced the sour odour of unwashed bodies and clothes that had defined military life for so long. Mechanical wringers pressed excess water from washed clothes with impressive efficiency. Drying facilities varied depending on climate and season, ranging from mechanical dryers to vast outdoor clotheslines where hundreds of garments flapped in the wind. Industrial pressing machines equipped with steam functions could smooth wrinkles from dozens of garments every hour. The resulting clothes, crisp and neat and smelling of soap, bore absolutely no resemblance to the wrinkled, stained, odorous uniforms that had marked them as defeated soldiers. Bedding received the exact same thorough treatment as personal clothing. Sheets and blankets were collected on weekly schedules, washed with the same care and attention, and returned to prisoners smelling fresh and clean. For men who had slept in mud or on piles of straw or directly on cold ground, clean sheets that were renewed every single week seemed almost obscenely luxurious, yet this happened with clockwork regularity that never varied. Beyond these fundamental services of grooming, clothing maintenance, and hygiene, American camps provided amenities that seemed completely impossible for facilities holding enemy prisoners. Canteens operated within the compounds where prisoners could spend the scrip they had earned through work details, purchasing cigarettes, candy bars, and various comfort items. Libraries were established and stocked with books in German, including works that had been banned in Nazi Germany for ideological reasons. Sports equipment was provided for organising soccer and volleyball leagues. Theatrical productions were permitted and even encouraged, with costumes manufactured in the tailoring shops specifically for performances. Educational opportunities absolutely stunned men from an army where independent thinking had been actively discouraged. Prisoners who possessed academic backgrounds before the war organised classes in foreign languages, mathematics, sciences, history, and philosophy. American authorities provided necessary supplies, including paper, pencils, blackboards, and chalk. Some camps developed extensive educational programs that were specifically designed to prepare prisoners for constructive post-war careers in whatever Germany would become after defeat. Music programs flourished beyond anything these men could have imagined possible in a prisoner of war camp. Musical instruments were provided through Red Cross channels and from American donations. Prisoner orchestras formed and rehearsed regularly. One camp in Texas eventually fielded a 40-piece orchestra capable of performing complex classical repertoire. Sheet music was obtained through various channels. Rehearsal spaces were designated and scheduled. Formal performances were organised and attended by both prisoners and guards. The surreal image of German prisoners performing Beethoven symphonies for American guards who applauded politely after each movement captured the strange normalcy that developed behind the barbed wire. Medical services extended far beyond emergency trauma care. Dental work included fillings and repairs, not just emergency extractions of rotten teeth. Eyeglasses were prescribed after proper examinations and then actually provided to prisoners who needed them. Mental health received attention as medical staff attempted to identify and treat combat trauma and psychological disorders. Surgical procedures were performed for non-emergency conditions that affected quality of life. The comprehensive medical care exceeded what many of these men had received even while serving as active soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Religious services were protected and actively facilitated by camp authorities. Catholic and Protestant chaplains were allowed to minister to prisoners of their respective faiths. Jewish prisoners, in an irony so profound it was almost unbearable given Germany's genocidal actions, were permitted to practice their faith freely and openly. Chapels or designated worship spaces were established in the camps. Religious materials, including Bibles and prayer books, were provided. Holy days were officially recognized and observed. Men who had participated in a regime that had attempted to destroy religious and ethnic minorities found themselves in an environment where religious freedom was simply assumed as a basic right. Work programs extended well beyond maintaining the camps themselves, connecting prisoners to American agricultural and industrial production needs. Prisoners picked cotton in the vast fields of Texas. They cut timber in the forests of Maine. They worked in food canning facilities in California. According to Geneva Convention requirements, they were paid for this labor, earning money that was saved in accounts for their eventual release. Working alongside American civilians during these labor details exposed prisoners to ordinary American life in ways that profoundly influenced their perspectives about the United States and its people. Interaction with American civilians during work assignments challenged every stereotype the Nazi propaganda machine had created. The Americans they actually met bore no resemblance to the violent gangsters they had been told to expect. They were farmers worried about crop yields, factory workers concerned about production quotas, ordinary people living ordinary lives. These encounters humanized the enemy in ways that undermined years of indoctrination. Letters from home, when they eventually began arriving after international mail systems were re-established, provided crucial psychological anchoring that prevented complete despair. Learning that family members were alive, receiving news about conditions in Germany, maintaining some connection to their previous lives, gave prisoners hope to sustain them through indefinite captivity. The mail system was administered with the same bureaucratic efficiency that characterized everything else, with strict censorship but reliable delivery. Recreation facilities developed into elaborate systems that rivaled what many prisoners had experienced in civilian life. Movie theaters were established where American films were shown with German subtitles, exposing prisoners to Hollywood's vision of American life. Athletic fields hosted organized tournaments in various sports. Libraries grew to contain thousands of volumes. Art studios were established where prisoners created murals to decorate barracks. Photography clubs formed and documented various aspects of camp life through images. These activities provided essential mental stimulation that prevented the psychological deterioration common in purely punitive imprisonment systems. Camp newspapers produced entirely by prisoners became surprisingly sophisticated publications. Using printing equipment provided by American authorities, prisoner journalists created newspapers featuring news summaries, sports coverage, cultural reviews, and even editorial content. These publications documented the strange normalcy that was developing behind barbed wire, creating a historical record of this unique experience. Social hierarchies reformed along completely different lines than military rank had established. Barbers became respected figures regardless of their former Wehrmacht status. Skilled tailors gained prestige. Talented cooks became valued community members. Men who spoke English well became important intermediaries between prisoners and authorities. A new social economy emerged based on practical usefulness rather than the insignia and medals that had defined worth in the military. Anti-Nazi prisoners created internal tensions that American authorities carefully managed. German communists, socialists, and Democrats who had been conscripted against their political will were mixed with convinced Nazi ideologues. The resulting debates and conflicts revealed an ideological diversity within Germany that Nazi uniformity and repression had successfully suppressed. These political fault lines would become increasingly important as plans for post-war Germany developed. Secret re-education programs operated alongside the visible services and amenities. American authorities carefully identified prisoners who demonstrated democratic leanings or who seemed receptive to anti-Nazi ideas. These men received additional reading materials, were engaged in particular discussions, and were essentially prepared to assist in the reconstruction and re-education of post-war Germany. The re-education was subtle and sophisticated, accomplished more through exposure to American democratic life than through heavy-handed propaganda. The contrast between treatment in American camps and the horrific conditions in Soviet prisoner camps became increasingly stark and impossible to ignore. While Americans provided barbershops, clean laundry, adequate food, and medical care, the Soviets were literally working German prisoners to death in Siberian mines and labor camps where survival rates were catastrophically low. This comparison was not lost on prisoners who gradually realized that capture by Americans rather than Soviets had quite literally saved their lives. As Germany's inevitable defeat approached and then occurred, the camps adapted their operations to prepare prisoners for eventual repatriation. English language classes intensified, vocational training programs expanded. Political discussions became more open as American authorities identified prisoners who might be suitable for administrative roles in occupied Germany. The transition from wartime to post-war status was managed systematically. Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945 created legal and practical complications regarding prisoner status. Many were reclassified as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, allowing American authorities to continue holding them while Europe stabilized and reconstruction began. Despite this change in classification, the services and treatment continued unchanged, maintaining men in a limbo state between war and peace. The pace of repatriation varied enormously based on factors that prisoners rarely fully understood. Former members of the Waffen-SS were held longest due to their association with war crimes. Prisoners who possessed needed technical skills or who had demonstrated clear anti-Nazi credentials were often released sooner to help with reconstruction efforts. Men continued receiving haircuts and doing laundry according to established routines while waiting months or even years for their release, finding psychological comfort in predictable patterns. The journey home revealed how profoundly the experience of American captivity had changed these men. Prisoners arrived back in destroyed German cities wearing clean, well-maintained American-issued clothing. Many were actually healthier and better nourished than the civilian population that had survived the bombing campaigns and the collapse of Germany's food distribution system. This created resentment and tension among Germans who had suffered terribly while these soldiers had been maintained in relative comfort by the enemy. Skills learned in the camps proved immediately valuable in the chaos of post-war Germany. Former prisoner barbers set up shops amid the ruins, providing essential grooming services. Tailors who had learned American production techniques found work in factories that were attempting to reopen. The English language skills acquired during captivity became economically valuable during the occupation period and reconstruction. The time in American camps, rather than being lost years, had actually provided practical education. The psychological impact of American captivity persisted long after physical repatriation. Former prisoners often spoke more positively about their time in American camps than about their service in the Wehrmacht. They had experienced American material abundance firsthand, had been treated with basic human dignity by the enemy, and understood viscerally that Nazi propaganda about American weakness and degeneracy had been completely false. These men became inadvertent ambassadors for American methods and values. Collective memories of fair treatment during captivity influenced German-American relations throughout the Cold War period. Former prisoners who had experienced American fairness and systematic respect for human dignity were far less susceptible to Soviet propaganda about American imperialism. When Germany was divided and both superpowers competed for German allegiance, these personal experiences mattered enormously. The logistics of providing these services required massive American resources and organization. Tons of soap, Thousands of razor blades, miles of fabric, industrial washing machines, barber equipment, and countless other supplies had to be manufactured, purchased, transported across oceans, and distributed to camps scattered across an entire continent. The systematic commitment to maintaining enemy prisoners properly demonstrated American industrial capacity and organizational competence. American guards and administrators who operated these camps navigated complex emotional terrain. Many had personal reasons to hate Germans, whether family members killed in combat or knowledge of Nazi atrocities. Yet they executed their duties professionally, ensuring German prisoners received adequate supplies and treatment. This professional execution, despite personal feelings, demonstrated military discipline at its finest. Relationships developed between guards and prisoners in unexpected ways. Guards learned basic German phrases. Prisoners taught Americans how to play soccer according to European rules. Shared humanity emerged through common activities and daily proximity. The enemy became individuals with names and personalities rather than abstract threats. German prisoners who worked in American factories and farms during labor details observed American industrial methods and work organization. These observations influenced approaches to rebuilding German industry after the war. The systematic organization and quality control standards demonstrated in camp operations became models that were consciously imported into post-war German manufacturing. The camps became sites of genuine cultural exchange, despite the fundamental inequality of the captor-captive relationship. Americans learned German songs from the prisoner orchestras. Germans learned American sports and became passionate about baseball. The various services and activities created spaces where former enemies discovered shared humanity through participation in common activities. Documentation through photography became an important propaganda tool, though this was likely not the primary motivation. Thousands of photographs were taken showing German prisoners receiving haircuts, attending concerts, playing sports, and engaging in normal human activities. These images were distributed internationally. Visual evidence of well-groomed, healthy prisoners was more persuasive than written reports could ever be. The services ultimately revealed a profound truth about power and control. Power could be exercised through provision just as effectively as through deprivation. German prisoners were conquered not through brutality, but through abundance. They were controlled through comfort and influenced through systematic care. The barbershops, tailoring services, and laundries defeated Nazi ideology more thoroughly than bombs could have achieved. Every former prisoner who described camp laundry services to family members was effectively advertising American power and abundance. Every healthy returnee was walking evidence of American resources and organizational capability. The investment in maintaining enemies well-generated returns that conventional warfare could never achieve. It was a form of soft power before that term had been invented. The profound shock German prisoners experienced upon arrival in American camps was fundamentally about being forced to reconsider basic assumptions about reality. They had been told repeatedly that Americans were weak, decadent, and cruel. The services they received demonstrated strength through superior organization and power through systematic care and abundance. The cognitive dissonance created by receiving professional haircuts and clean laundry from the enemy forced psychological adjustments that outlasted the captivity itself and influenced the remainder of their lives. These extensive services represented a unique historical moment when American military efficiency, economic abundance, and psychological sophistication combined to create an approach to managing enemy prisoners that was simultaneously practical and profoundly transformative. The barbershops, tailoring workshops, and industrial laundries became spaces where the absolute categories of warfare were quietly but systematically undermined through attention to universal human needs for dignity and cleanliness. German prisoners who had never expected such treatment discovered truths about their captors and about themselves that no amount of propaganda could have revealed or overcome. Through the simple, consistent provision of haircuts, expertly mended clothes, and reliably clean laundry, They experienced a defeat more complete and more permanent than military conquest alone could have achieved. They were conquered through comfort, controlled through systematic care, and fundamentally transformed through the provision of services that maintained their physical bodies while simultaneously reshaping their understanding of the world and their place in it.